The morning sun cast long shadows across the grand estate as William Ashworth adjusted his tie one final time. His reflection in the ornate mirror showed a man who had aged beyond his years, worry lines etched deep around his eyes. Beside him, his wife Catherine smoothed down her navy dress, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her pearl earrings. "Are you ready for this?" William asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of everything they had endured over the past months. Catherine met his gaze in the mirror, her green eyes reflecting a mixture of determination and fear. "As ready as we'll ever be," she replied, though her voice betrayed the uncertainty she felt deep in her bones. Today would change everything, one way or another. The couple had been preparing for this moment for weeks, ever since the phone call that had shattered their carefully constructed world. Their eldest son, 18-year-old James, had been missing for 3 days when the call came through. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and terrifying in its certainty. James had been found, but the circumstances were far from what any parent would hope to hear. William remembered the exact moment the detective's words had pierced through his consciousness like a blade. "Mr. Ashworth, we've located your son. He's alive, but there's been an incident. We need you and your wife to come to the hospital immediately." The drive to St. Mary's Hospital had been the longest 20 minutes of their lives, filled with frantic prayers and desperate hopes that whatever had happened could somehow be undone. What they discovered at the hospital was worse than their darkest imaginings. James lay unconscious in the intensive care unit, his young face barely recognizable beneath the bandages and medical equipment. The attending physician, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, had explained the situation with gentle professionalism, but her words felt like hammer blows to William and Catherine's hearts. "Your son was involved in what appears to be a serious accident," Dr. Mitchell had said, her clipboard held firmly against her chest. "He sustained significant head trauma, along with multiple fractures and internal injuries. We've managed to stabilize him, but the next 48 hours will be critical." But it wasn't just an accident, as they would soon learn. Detective Robert Hayes had pulled them aside later that evening, his weathered face grave with the weight of difficult news. "Mr. and Mrs. Ashworth, I need to inform you that we have reason to believe your son's injuries weren't caused by an accident. We're treating this as a potential assault case." The words had hit Catherine like a physical blow, and she had sunk into the uncomfortable plastic hospital chair, her world spinning out of control. William had stood frozen, his mind struggling to process the implications of what the detective was telling them. Their son, their bright, talented boy who had everything to live for, had been deliberately hurt by someone. As the days passed, and James remained unconscious, William and Catherine had thrown themselves into uncovering the truth. They spent countless hours by their son's bedside, holding his hand and whispering encouragement into his unhearing ears. But they also began their own investigation, reaching out to James's friends, his teachers, anyone who might have insight into what had led to that terrible night. What they discovered painted a picture that broke their hearts all over again. James had been struggling more than they realized. Despite his academic success and seemingly bright future, he had been dealing with intense pressure from multiple sources. There were problems at university that he hadn't shared with them, conflicts with other students that had escalated beyond what anyone had anticipated. Sarah Chun, James's girlfriend, had been the first to open up about what had really been happening. With tears streaming down her young face, she had told them about the harassment James had been enduring from a group of older students. It had started as minor hazing, typical university pranks that most students endured and forgot about. But it had escalated week by week, becoming more personal, more vicious, until it had consumed James's daily life. "He tried to handle it on his own," Sarah had explained, her voice breaking. "He didn't want to worry you, and he thought if he just kept his head down and focused on his studies, they would eventually lose interest and move on to someone else. But they didn't stop. They just got worse." William had felt a surge of anger unlike anything he had ever experienced. How had they missed the signs? How had their son been suffering in silence while they went about their daily routines, oblivious to his pain? Catherine had asked herself the same questions, replaying every conversation they had shared with James over the past months, searching for clues they should have recognized. The investigation had revealed that the incident occurred after James had finally decided to report the harassment to university authorities. The group of students responsible had apparently learned about his decision before any official action could be taken. What happened next was still being pieced together by the police, but witness accounts suggested that James had been cornered after leaving the library late one evening. According to Sarah and several other students who had come forward after James's hospitalization, the confrontation had been planned. The perpetrators had waited for him, knowing his routine, knowing he would be alone and vulnerable. What was meant to be intimidation had turned violent when James had refused to back down from his decision to report them. The security footage from that night was grainy and partially obscured, but it showed enough to confirm that James had been outnumbered and outmatched. The images were difficult to watch, showing their son trying to defend himself against multiple attackers before ultimately being overwhelmed. William had insisted on viewing the footage himself, despite the detective's warnings about its disturbing content. Watching his son being attacked had been one of the most devastating experiences of William's life. The helplessness he felt, knowing that this had already happened and there was nothing he could do to change it, was overwhelming. But it also fueled his determination to see justice done, to ensure that those responsible would face the full consequences of their actions. Catherine had chosen not to watch the footage, but the descriptions provided by the detective were enough to fuel her own sense of outrage and determination. She had channeled her energy into supporting James's recovery while also working to ensure that other students wouldn't have to endure what their son had experienced. The university's response had been swift but, in William and Catherine's opinion, inadequate. The students involved had been suspended pending the outcome of the police investigation, but the couple felt that the institution had failed in its fundamental duty to protect their son. They had retained legal counsel and were preparing to take action against both the perpetrators and the university itself. As they prepared to leave for the courthouse that morning, both William and Catherine were acutely aware that this was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey. The preliminary hearing would determine whether the case would proceed to trial, and they knew that their testimony would be crucial in establishing the severity of what had happened to their son. James had regained consciousness 3 days earlier, a moment that had brought indescribable relief and joy to his parents. But his recovery was far from complete, and the extent of his long-term injuries was still being evaluated. The doctors were cautiously optimistic about his physical recovery, but the psychological trauma would require extensive therapy and support. When James had first opened his eyes and recognized his parents, Catherine had broken down completely. The relief of seeing her son awake and responsive had overwhelmed every other emotion she had been carrying. William had maintained his composure long enough to reassure James that he was safe and that everything would be all right. But later that night, in the privacy of their hotel room, he had allowed himself to cry for the first time since the ordeal began. Their son's first coherent words had been an apology, which had broken their hearts all over again. "I'm sorry," he had whispered through cracked lips. "I should have told you what was happening. I thought I could handle it on my own." William had immediately reassured him that none of this was his fault, that he had nothing to apologize for. But he could see that James was carrying an enormous burden of guilt and shame. The boy blamed himself for not speaking up sooner, for not seeking help, for somehow inviting the harassment that had nearly cost him his life. The family had spent hours talking once James was strong enough for extended conversations. He had shared details about the months of torment he had endured, the fear that had become a constant companion, and the isolation he had felt as the situation escalated. Each revelation had been like a fresh wound for his parents, who struggled with their own guilt at not recognizing their son's distress. But they had also seen glimpses of the strong, resilient young man James was becoming through this ordeal. Despite everything he had been through, he remained determined to see his attackers held accountable. He wanted to return to university, to complete his education, and to ensure that other students wouldn't have to face what he had experienced. "I won't let them win by making me hide," he had told his parents with a determination that reminded William of Catherine's own strength. "What they did to me was wrong, and I want everyone to know it. I want to make sure this never happens to anyone else." The courage their son had shown in the face of such trauma had inspired both William and Catherine to be stronger than they thought possible. They had spent the past week preparing for today's hearing, working with their legal team to ensure that every detail of James's ordeal would be properly presented to the court. The defendants in the case were 4 university students, aged 19 to 22, who came from prominent families in the community. Their parents had retained expensive legal representation, and there had already been attempts to minimize the severity of the charges and to portray the incident as a prank gone wrong rather than a deliberate assault. William and Catherine had been warned that the defense would likely attempt to paint James as somehow responsible for what had happened to him. They would probably argue that he had provoked the attack, or that his injuries were the result of an accident during what they would characterize as a mutual confrontation. The thought of their son being blamed for his own victimization was almost unbearable, but their attorney had prepared them for this possibility. Unfortunately, she had explained, victim blaming is a common defense strategy in cases like this. We need to be ready to counter these arguments with facts and evidence. As they prepared to leave their hotel that morning, William and Catherine had received an unexpected phone call from the detective handling their case. Detective Hayes had called to inform them that additional witnesses had come forward, students who had previously been too frightened to speak up, but who now felt compelled to share what they knew about the pattern of harassment that had preceded the attack. This new testimony significantly strengthens our case, the detective had explained. These witnesses can establish that this wasn't an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of months of systematic harassment and intimidation. The news had provided some comfort to William and Catherine, but they knew that the legal process would be long and challenging regardless of how strong their case might be. They had been advised that even if the defendants were convicted, the appeals process could extend for years, and there was always the possibility that justice might not be served in the way they hoped. But they were determined to see this through, not just for James, but for every student who might find themselves in a similar situation. Catherine had already begun working with advocacy groups that supported victims of campus violence, and William had started speaking with other parents who had faced similar ordeals with their own children. The support they had received from their community had been overwhelming and deeply moving. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers had reached out to offer assistance, encouragement, and resources. James's story had resonated with many people who had their own experiences with bullying and harassment, and the family had received hundreds of letters and messages of support. But they had also faced unexpected challenges and disappointments. Some people they had considered close friends had distanced themselves from the family, apparently uncomfortable with the controversy surrounding the case. There had been whispered suggestions that James must have done something to provoke the attack, or that the family was overreacting to what was essentially a college prank. These reactions had been particularly painful for Catherine, who had always prided herself on being a good judge of character. Discovering that people she had trusted and respected could be so callous about her son's suffering had been a harsh lesson in human nature. As they walked toward their car that morning, William reached for Catherine's hand, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that had become their source of mutual strength throughout this ordeal. They had always been a strong couple, but the past months had tested their relationship in ways they had never imagined possible. There had been moments when the stress and grief had threatened to drive them apart. William had thrown himself into the investigation and legal preparations, working 18-hour days and barely sleeping. Catherine had focused on James's medical care and recovery, spending every possible moment at his bedside and coordinating with his doctors and therapists. They had snapped at each other over minor issues, exhaustion and stress making them both more irritable and less patient than usual. There had been disagreements about legal strategy, about how much information to share with James about the case, and about how to handle the media attention that had surrounded the story. But through it all, they had managed to remember that they were on the same side, fighting for the same goal. They loved their son, and they would do whatever it took to help him heal and to ensure that justice was served. Their marriage had been strengthened by their shared commitment to seeing this through together. The drive to the courthouse was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts as they navigated the morning traffic. William found himself thinking about James as a small boy, full of energy and curiosity, always asking questions and always ready with a smile. It was difficult to reconcile those memories with the image of his son lying broken and unconscious in a hospital bed. Catherine was thinking about the future, about the long road of recovery that lay ahead for their family. James would need extensive physical therapy to regain full use of his left arm, which had been severely damaged in the attack. He would also need counseling to deal with the psychological trauma, and there were no guarantees about how complete his recovery would be. But she was also thinking about the strength she had seen in her son over the past week. Despite everything he had endured, James remained determined to move forward with his life. He had already begun making plans to return to school, though he would be transferring to a different university where he could start fresh without the constant reminders of what had happened to him. As they approached the courthouse, both William Catherine could see the crowd of people gathered outside. There were reporters with cameras and microphones, supporters holding signs calling for justice, and what appeared to be family members of both the victim and the defendants. The sight of the media circus made Catherine's stomach churn with anxiety. We're doing this for James, and for every other kid who might be in his situation someday. Catherine nodded, taking a deep breath to steady herself. She thought about her son, still recovering in his hospital bed, but determined to see this through. If James could be brave enough to face his attackers in court despite everything he had suffered, then she could certainly be brave enough to walk through a crowd of reporters. As they stepped out of their car and began walking toward the courthouse entrance, William and Catherine held their heads high. They knew that today would be difficult, that they would have to relive the worst moments of their lives in front of strangers and cameras. But they also knew that this was just the first step in a longer journey toward justice and healing. The crowd of reporters surged toward them as they approached, microphones thrust in their direction, and questions shouted from all angles. William had prepared a brief statement, but seeing the chaos and the invasive nature of the media attention, he decided to simply walk past without commenting. Mr. Ashworth, Mrs. Ashworth, how is James doing? Do you believe justice will be served today? The questions came rapid fire, but the couple kept walking, their eyes fixed on the courthouse steps ahead of them. Catherine felt tears threatening to spill over as she heard their son's name being shouted by strangers, but she forced herself to maintain her composure. This was not the time to break down. James needed them to be strong, and they would not let him down. As they reached the courthouse steps, William paused and turned to face the crowd of reporters. Catherine looked at him with surprise, not expecting him to make any public statements at this early stage of the proceedings. My wife and I want to thank everyone who has supported our family during this difficult time, William said, his voice clear and strong despite the emotion he was feeling. We believe in the justice system, and we trust that the truth will come out during these proceedings. Our son is a survivor, and we will continue to fight for him and for all students who deserve to feel safe in their educational environments. With that brief statement, William turned and guided Catherine up the remaining steps and into the courthouse. Behind them, the crowd continued to buzz with activity, but ahead of them lay the beginning of what they hoped would be a path to justice and closure for their family. The courtroom was smaller than William had expected, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that cast everything in a harsh, clinical glow. As he and Catherine settled into their seats behind the prosecutor's table, William couldn't help but notice how ordinary it all seemed for something that felt so monumentally important to their family's future. District Attorney Margaret Reynolds had met with them briefly before the hearing began, reviewing the key points of testimony and preparing them for what they might hear from the defense. She was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing, and she had impressed both William and Catherine with her thorough preparation and genuine concern for James's welfare. I want you to know that we take these charges very seriously, she had told them in her office the previous week. This wasn't just a college prank gone wrong, as the defense will undoubtedly try to portray it. What happened to your son was a calculated assault by multiple perpetrators who had been systematically harassing him for months. The defendants sat at the table across the aisle, flanked by their expensive attorneys. William forced himself to look at each of them. These were young men who had nearly killed his son. They looked so ordinary, so much like any other college students, that it was difficult to reconcile their appearance with the brutality they had inflicted on James. Marcus Thompson, the apparent ringleader, was 22 years old and came from one of the wealthiest families in the state. His father owned a chain of successful restaurants, and the family had donated substantial amounts to the university over the years. Marcus sat with perfect posture, his expression neutral, occasionally whispering to his attorney, but never once looking in the direction of William and Catherine. Beside him sat Dylan Walsh, a 19-year-old business major whose father served on the university's board of trustees. Dylan appeared nervous, fidgeting with his tie and stealing glances at the gallery behind him where his parents sat with grim expressions. Of all the defendants, he seemed the most affected by the gravity of the situation. The third defendant, Kevin Rodriguez, was 20 years old and had been on the university's wrestling team before his suspension. He was powerfully built, and William couldn't help but think about how terrifying it must have been for James to face him and the others in that dark parking lot. Kevin stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, showing no emotion whatsoever. The final defendant, Brian Mitchell, was 21 and had previously been considered one of the university's most promising students. He had been on the dean's list every semester and was active in several campus organizations. His transformation from model student to criminal defendant was a stark reminder that appearances could be deeply deceiving. As Judge Patricia Hoffman entered the courtroom, everyone rose to their feet. She was a veteran jurist known for her fairness, but also for her no-nonsense approach to criminal proceedings. William had researched her background extensively and felt cautiously optimistic that she would ensure a fair hearing for all parties involved. "Please be seated," Judge Hoffman said as she settled behind the bench. "We're here today for the preliminary hearing in the case of the state versus Marcus Thompson, Dylan Walsh, Kevin Rodriguez, and Brian Mitchell. The defendants are charged with aggravated assault, conspiracy to commit assault, and intimidation." The prosecutors stood to present the state's case, and William felt his heart rate increase as the formal proceedings began. This was the moment when everything would become real, when the attack on their son would be dissected and analyzed in the harsh light of legal scrutiny. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that these 4 defendants engaged in a months-long campaign of harassment and intimidation against the victim, James Ashworth," DA Reynolds began. This harassment escalated on the night of October 15th when the defendants ambushed Mr. Ashworth in the university parking lot, inflicting injuries that nearly cost him his life. Reynolds methodically outlined the state's case, describing the pattern of harassment that had preceded the attack and the evidence that would prove the defendant's guilt. She spoke about the security footage, the witness testimony, and the medical evidence that documented the severity of James's injuries. The victim sustained a traumatic brain injury, multiple fractures to his left arm and ribs, and internal bleeding that required emergency surgery, she continued. These injuries were not the result of a mutual altercation or an accident, as the defense may suggest. They were the intentional result of a coordinated attack by 4 individuals against one. William watched the faces of the defendants as the prosecutor spoke, searching for any sign of remorse or recognition of the harm they had caused. Marcus Thompson remained stone-faced throughout the presentation, while Dylan Walsh seemed to grow more uncomfortable with each detail of James's injuries. When it was time for the defense to present their arguments, Marcus Thompson's attorney, Harold Blackwell, stood with the confidence of someone who had never lost a case he couldn't afford to lose. He was tall and imposing, with silver hair and an expensive suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. "Your Honor, while we don't dispute that an unfortunate incident occurred, the prosecution's characterization of events is both inaccurate and inflammatory," Blackwell began. "What happened that night was the result of a confrontation that escalated beyond what anyone intended. My clients are not the predatory criminals the prosecution would have you believe." Catherine felt her anger rising as she listened to the defense attorney attempt to minimize what had happened to their son. The word "unfortunate" seemed particularly offensive when applied to an attack that had nearly killed James. Blackwell went on to argue that the alleged harassment had been exaggerated, that it was typical behavior among college students that had been blown out of proportion after the fact. He suggested that James himself bore some responsibility for what had occurred, claiming that he had been antagonistic toward the defendants and had initiated the confrontation that led to his injuries. "The evidence will show that Mr. Ashworth was not the innocent victim the prosecution portrays," Blackwell continued. "He had been making false accusations against my clients for weeks, threatening to file complaints that could have damaged their academic and professional futures. When they confronted him about these threats, the situation unfortunately escalated. William had to restrain himself from standing up and objecting to these characterizations of his son. Everything the defense attorney was saying was not only false, but deliberately cruel, designed to shift blame from the perpetrators to the victim. It was exactly what their own attorney had warned them to expect, but hearing it spoken aloud in open court was still shocking. The first witness called by the prosecution was Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the emergency room physician who had treated James on the night of the attack. She took the stand with professional composure, but William could see the impact that treating his son had made on her. "When the ambulance brought Mr. Ashworth to our emergency department, he was unconscious and in critical condition," Dr. Mitchell testified. He had suffered severe head trauma consistent with being struck multiple times with blunt objects. His left arm was badly fractured in several places, and he had internal bleeding that required immediate surgical intervention. DA Reynolds asked Dr. Mitchell to describe James's injuries in detail, and With each medical term and description, Catherine felt as though she was reliving that terrible night all over again. The clinical language made everything sound even more horrific somehow, reducing her son's suffering to a list of broken bones and damaged organs. In your professional opinion, Dr. Mitchell, could these injuries have been caused accidentally? The prosecutor asked. Absolutely not, Dr. Mitchell replied firmly. The pattern and severity of Mr. Ashworth's injuries were consistent with a sustained, deliberate assault. The head trauma alone showed evidence of multiple impacts, and the fractures to his arm were what we would typically see in cases of defensive injuries, where a victim is trying to protect themselves from attack. When it was time for cross-examination, Harold Blackwell approached the witness with the practiced ease of someone who had challenged medical testimony hundreds of times before. Dr. Mitchell, is it possible that some of Mr. Ashworth's injuries could have been caused by falling during the altercation? He asked. Some injuries could be consistent with a fall, but not all of them, Dr. Mitchell replied carefully. The pattern of trauma was more consistent with deliberate strikes than with accidental injury from falling. Blackwell pressed further, trying to establish doubt about the cause of James's injuries, but Dr. Mitchell remained firm in her assessment. Her testimony was compelling and professional, and William felt cautiously optimistic about how it had gone. The next witness was Detective Robert Hayes, who had led the investigation into the attack. He was a veteran investigator with over 20 years of experience, and his testimony focused on the evidence that had been gathered at the scene and during the subsequent investigation. We recovered several items from the parking lot that were used as weapons during the assault, Detective Hayes testified. These included a metal pipe and what appeared to be a wooden baseball bat. Both items had blood evidence consistent with the victim's injuries, and we were able to recover fingerprints from both weapons that matched 3 of the 4 defendants. This was news to William and Catherine, who had not been informed about the fingerprint evidence before today. The revelation that the attack had involved weapons made everything seem even more calculated and vicious than they had previously understood. Detective Hayes also testified about the security footage that had captured portions of the attack. While the footage was grainy and partially obscured, it clearly showed multiple individuals surrounding James and striking him repeatedly even after he had fallen to the ground. The video evidence shows that this was not a mutual altercation, Detective Hayes explained. The victim was outnumbered 4-1, and the attack continued even after he was no longer able to defend himself. During cross-examination, Blackwell tried to challenge the quality of the video evidence and the reliability of the fingerprint analysis, but Detective Hayes' testimony remained solid throughout the questioning. The prosecution then called Sarah Chun, James's girlfriend, to testify about the harassment that had preceded the attack. Sarah was 19 years old and clearly nervous about testifying, but she spoke with quiet strength about what she had witnessed. James was scared, Sarah testified, her voice barely above a whisper. He tried to hide it from everyone, but I could see how the harassment was affecting him. He stopped eating regularly, he wasn't sleeping well, and he became increasingly isolated from his friends. Sarah described specific incidents of harassment that she had witnessed, including times when the defendants had cornered James in the library, spread rumors about him on social media, and vandalized his dormitory room. Each detail painted a picture of systematic intimidation that had made James's life miserable for months before the attack. Did Mr. Ashworth ever talk about reporting the harassment to university authorities? D.A. Reynolds asked. He struggled with that decision for weeks, Sarah replied. He was afraid that reporting it would make things worse, but eventually he decided that he had to do something. He was worried that if he didn't speak up, they might target other students too. When Blackwell cross-examined Sarah, he tried to suggest that she had exaggerated or misunderstood what she had witnessed. He implied that what she characterized as harassment was actually normal college behavior, and he questioned whether James had been as affected by it as she claimed. Isn't it true, Miss Chun, that Mr. Ashworth had a history of overreacting to situations? Blackwell asked. No, that's not true at all, Sarah replied firmly. James was one of the most level-headed people I knew. He would never have reported the harassment if it hadn't been serious. Several other students testified about incidents they had witnessed, and, with each testimony, the pattern of harassment became clearer and more disturbing. It was obvious that what had happened to James was not an isolated incident, but the culmination of months of escalating intimidation. The defense then began presenting their case, starting with character witnesses for each of the defendants. Teachers, coaches, and family friends took the stand to testify about what good students and citizens the defendants had been before this incident. Marcus Thompson's high school football coach testified that Marcus had been a team captain who had shown leadership qualities and had never been involved in any disciplinary issues. Dylan Walsh's academic advisor spoke about his strong grades and his involvement in community service projects. Catherine found these testimonials deeply frustrating. While she didn't doubt that the defendants might have been model citizens in other contexts, none of that changed what they had done to her son. If anything, it made their actions seem even more calculated and cruel. The defense also called Dr. Richard Hoffman, a forensic expert who had been hired to review the evidence in the case. Dr. Hoffman attempted to challenge some of the prosecution's medical evidence, suggesting that James's injuries could have been less severe than originally diagnosed, and that some of them might have been caused by factors other than the attack. However, during cross-examination, it became clear that Dr. Hoffman had not personally examined James and was basing his opinions on incomplete medical records. His testimony seemed weak compared to the first-hand account provided by Dr. Mitchell. As the hearing progressed, William and Catherine found themselves riding an emotional roller coaster. Moments when the prosecution's case seemed strongest were followed by periods when the defense managed to introduce doubt or confusion. The legal process was more complex and unpredictable than either of them had anticipated. During a brief recess, D.A. Reynolds approached them to discuss how she thought the hearing was progressing. "I believe we've presented a strong case," she told them. "The evidence clearly establishes that your son was the victim of a coordinated assault, and I'm confident that the judge will find probable cause to move forward with the trial." But William had noticed that Judge Hoffman had been taking extensive notes throughout the proceedings, and her expression had remained neutral throughout both the prosecution and defense presentations. It was impossible to tell what she was thinking or how she would ultimately rule. The final witness of the day was Dr. Lisa Martinez, the neuropsychologist who had been treating James since he regained consciousness. She testified about the ongoing effects of his traumatic brain injury and the long-term challenges he would likely face as a result of the attack. "Mr. Ashworth has made remarkable progress in his recovery," Dr. Martinez testified. "However, he continues to experience cognitive difficulties, including problems with memory, concentration, and processing speed. These issues may improve over time, but it's likely that he will face ongoing challenges as a result of his injuries." This testimony was particularly difficult for William and Catherine to hear, as it confirmed their worst fears about the long-term impact of the attack on their son's future. James had always been an exceptional student with plans to attend graduate school and pursue a career in research. Now, those dreams might be forever changed by the actions of four young men who had decided to take their frustrations out on him. As the hearing drew to a close, both sides presented their final arguments about whether there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. The prosecution argued that the evidence clearly established probable cause for all charges, while the defense maintained that the incident had been a mutual altercation that had been mischaracterized by the prosecution. Judge Hoffman announced that she would take the matter under advisement and would issue her ruling within 48 hours. As the court session ended and people began filing out of the courtroom, William and Catherine remained seated, emotionally drained from the day's proceedings. They had hoped that the hearing would provide some sense of closure or resolution, but instead it had raised new questions and concerns. The defense had been more aggressive than they had expected, and the possibility that the defendants might avoid serious consequences seemed more real than it had before. As they finally stood to leave, Catherine noticed that Marcus Thompson was looking directly at her for the first time all day. There was something in his expression that chilled her to the bone, a combination of arrogance and contempt that suggested he felt no remorse whatsoever for what he had done to their son. "He doesn't think he did anything wrong," Catherine whispered to William as they walked toward the exit. William nodded grimly. "That's what makes this so terrifying. If they don't see anything wrong with what they did to James, what's to stop them from doing it to someone else?" As they stepped outside the courthouse, they were once again confronted by the crowd of reporters and cameras. This time, William chose not to make any statement, instead guiding Catherine quickly toward their car while the questions and camera flashes continued around them. The drive back to their hotel was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts about what they had experienced during the hearing. The legal process was proving to be even more challenging than they had anticipated, and they were beginning to understand that this was only the beginning of what would likely be a long and difficult journey toward justice for their son. The call came at 6:30 in the morning, jarring William from the restless sleep that had become his norm over the past weeks. Catherine stirred beside him as he reached for his phone, and they both held their breath as they saw Detective Hayes' name on the screen. "Mr. Ashworth, I have news about the judge's ruling," Detective Hayes said without preamble. His voice was calm, but carried an undertone that William couldn't quite interpret. "Judge Hoffman has decided to bind the case over for trial on all charges. All 4 defendants will face trial for aggravated assault, conspiracy, and intimidation." William felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was tempered by the detective's tone. "That's good news, isn't it?" he asked. "It is good news," Detective Hayes confirmed. "However, there have been some developments overnight that you need to know about. One of the defendants, Dylan Walsh, has indicated through his attorney that he may be willing to cooperate with the prosecution in exchange for a plea agreement." Catherine had been listening to William's side of the conversation, and now she moved closer so she could hear the detective's words directly. The possibility of one of the defendants testifying against the others was something their attorney had mentioned as a possibility, but hearing that it might actually happen was both encouraging and concerning. "What would that mean for the case?" William asked. "It could significantly strengthen the prosecution's position," Detective Hayes explained. "If Walsh is willing to testify about the planning that went into the attack and the specific roles each defendant played, it would provide insider testimony that could be crucial for securing convictions against the other 3. After ending the call with Detective Hayes, William and Catherine sat in their hotel room bed, trying to process this new development. They had been preparing themselves for a long, difficult trial where it would be James's word against his attackers. The possibility of one of the defendants turning against the others changed the entire dynamic of the case. Within hours, they were meeting with DA Reynolds in her office to discuss the plea agreement being proposed by Dylan Walsh's attorney. The young prosecutor looked tired but determined as she outlined the terms that had been suggested. "Walsh is willing to plead guilty to a reduced charge of simple assault and testify against the other 3 defendants," Reynolds explained. "In exchange, he would receive a sentence of 2 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 18 months. Catherine felt conflicted about the proposal. Part of her wanted all 4 defendants to face the full consequences of their actions, but she also recognized that Walsh's testimony could be the key to ensuring that the other 3 didn't escape justice entirely. "What do you think James would want us to do?" William asked his wife. Catherine considered the question carefully. Over the past week, as James had continued to recover, they had begun having more detailed conversations with him about the legal proceedings. He had been remarkably mature in his approach to the situation, focusing more on preventing future incidents than on seeking revenge against his attackers. "I think James would want us to do whatever gives us the best chance of holding them all accountable," Catherine replied. "If Walsh's testimony can help convict the others, especially Marcus Thompson, then maybe we should consider it." DA Reynolds nodded. "I agree. Thompson appears to have been the ringleader, and Rodriguez and Mitchell were the ones who actually wielded the weapons according to the evidence we've gathered. Walsh seems to have been the most reluctant participant, and his cooperation could be crucial." They spent the next several hours reviewing the details of Walsh's proposed testimony. According to his attorney, Dylan was prepared to admit that the attack had been planned in advance, that Marcus Thompson had recruited the others specifically to intimidate James, and that the violence had escalated beyond what any of them had originally intended. Most importantly, Walsh was willing to testify that the attack had been motivated by James's decision to report their harassment to university authorities. This would establish that the assault was not only deliberate but was specifically intended to prevent James from seeking help through proper channels. "This testimony would help us establish the conspiracy charge," Reynolds explained. Without insider testimony, proving that the 4 defendants planned the attack together would be much more difficult. William found himself thinking about Dylan Walsh, trying to understand what had led a seemingly normal college student to participate in such a vicious attack. According to the background information they had gathered, Walsh had no prior criminal record and had been considered a good student before this incident. During the preliminary hearing, Walsh had appeared to be the most affected by the gravity of the situation. Unlike Marcus Thompson, who had shown no emotion whatsoever, Walsh had seemed genuinely disturbed by the testimony about James's injuries. "Do you think he's truly remorseful, or is he just trying to save himself?" Catherine asked DA Reynolds. "It's probably a combination of both," Reynolds replied honestly. "He's certainly motivated by self-preservation, but, according to his attorney, he's also been struggling with guilt about what happened. His parents had been pushing him to cooperate since they learned the full extent of James's injuries. The decision about whether to accept Walsh's plea agreement would ultimately be made by DA Reynolds and her supervisors, but they wanted William and Catherine's input as the victim's family. It was a difficult decision that required them to balance their desire for justice with the practical realities of the legal system. That afternoon, they drove to the hospital to discuss the situation with James. Their son had been transferred from the intensive care unit to a regular room, and his recovery was progressing better than the doctors had initially hoped. He was still experiencing headaches and memory issues, but his physical injuries were healing well. James listened carefully as his parents explained the plea agreement offer, asking thoughtful questions about the implications for the trial and the potential sentences the other defendants might face. Despite everything he had been through, he maintained a remarkably clear perspective on the situation. "I want them to be held accountable for what they did," James said slowly, his words slightly slurred from the medication he was taking. "But I also want to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to other students. If Walsh's testimony can help prevent that, then I think we should consider the deal." Catherine was struck once again by her son's maturity and his focus on the broader implications of the case rather than just personal revenge. It reminded her of why she was so proud of the young man he was becoming, despite the terrible circumstances that had brought them to this point. "Are you prepared for what it will mean to have Walsh testify?" William asked his son. "He's going to have to describe in detail what happened that night and what each person did. It might be difficult to hear." James nodded slowly. "I know it won't be easy, but I think I need to hear it. I don't remember everything that happened after they started hitting me, and I think understanding the full scope of what they did might actually help me process it better." Over the following days, as DA Reynolds worked out the final details of Walsh's plea agreement, William and Catherine found themselves dealing with increased media attention. News of the potential cooperation had somehow leaked to the press, and reporters were once again camped outside their hotel and the hospital. The story had captured public attention in part because of the contrast between the defendants' privileged backgrounds and the severity of their alleged crimes. Marcus Thompson's family, in particular, had tried to use their influence to minimize media coverage, but their efforts had largely backfired and drawn even more attention to the case. Catherine found the media scrutiny exhausting and invasive. She understood that public attention could be helpful in ensuring that the case was taken seriously, but she also felt that their family's privacy was being violated on a daily basis. Every time they left the hotel or the hospital, they were confronted with cameras and questions. The situation became even more complicated when they learned that the defendants' families had hired a public relations firm to manage their image during the trial. Suddenly, stories began appearing in the media that portrayed the four young men as good students who had made a terrible mistake, while questioning James's credibility and suggesting that he had somehow provoked the attack. "This is exactly what we were afraid of," Catherine told William as they read yet another article that seemed sympathetic to the defendants. "They're trying to turn James into the villain in his own assault case." William shared his wife's frustration, but he also recognized that this was part of the adversarial legal process they had to navigate. Their own attorney had warned them that the defense would likely try to wage a public relations battle alongside the legal one. "We have to trust that the jury will see through their spin," Williams said. "The evidence is on our side, and with Walsh's testimony, we should have a strong case." But the media battle was taking its toll on their entire family. James had seen some of the news coverage, and it had clearly affected him deeply. He struggled with the suggestion that he was somehow responsible for what had happened to him, even though he intellectually understood that it wasn't true. "Why are they saying those things about me?" James asked his parents during one of their visits. "I never did anything to hurt them. I just wanted them to leave me alone." Catherine felt her heart break as she heard the confusion and pain in her son's voice. It was devastating to see him question himself when he had been the victim of such a brutal attack. She wanted to protect him from the ugliness of the public discourse, but she also knew that he needed to understand what they were facing. "Some people will say anything to avoid taking responsibility for their actions," she explained. "What those articles say about you doesn't make it true, and it doesn't change what really happened that night." As the trial date approached, the pressure on the family continued to mount. They received both supportive messages and hostile communications from strangers who had formed opinions about the case based on media coverage. Some people praised them for standing up for their son, while others accused them of destroying the futures of four promising young men over what they characterized as a college fight. The hostile messages were particularly difficult for Catherine to handle. She couldn't understand how anyone could read about what had happened to James and come away thinking that his attackers were the victims. The fact that there were people who saw 4 young men beating one unconscious victim as acceptable behavior was deeply disturbing to her. "I keep thinking about the parents of other students," Catherine told William one evening. "How many of them are reading these articles and thinking that if something like this happened to their child, they would face the same kind of attacks on their character?" William shared her concerns about the broader implications of the case. If the defendants managed to escape serious consequences, or if the public discourse continued to focus on blaming the victim, it would send a message to other potential perpetrators that this kind of behavior was acceptable. The plea agreement with Dylan Walsh was finalized 3 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin. He would plead guilty to simple assault and serve 18 months in prison in exchange for his cooperation. The terms of the agreement required him to testify truthfully about the planning and execution of the attack, and if he was found to have lied or withheld information, the original charges would be reinstated. William and Catherine attended the hearing where Walsh entered his guilty plea, wanting to see how he handled the formal admission of his guilt. As he stood before Judge Hoffman and admitted his role in the attack on their son, Dylan Walsh appeared genuinely remorseful for the first time since the case began. "I deeply regret my actions and the harm they caused to James Ashworth and his family," Walsh said when given the opportunity to address the court. "I know that my words cannot undo what happened, but I want to do everything I can to help ensure that justice is served for my former co-defendants." Catherine watched Walsh's parents in the gallery as their son admitted his guilt. His mother was crying quietly, while his father sat with his head in his hands. They looked like a family that had been destroyed by their son's choices, and Catherine found herself feeling a surprising amount of sympathy for them. After the hearing, Walsh's attorney approached William and Catherine to express his client's desire to apologize personally to their family. This request caught them off guard, as they hadn't expected any of the defendants to want direct contact with them. "I don't think I'm ready for that," Catherine told William later. "I appreciate that he wants to take responsibility, but I'm not sure I can handle hearing an apology from someone who helped put our son in the hospital." William understood his wife's feelings, but part of him was curious about what Walsh might have to say. The young man's cooperation was crucial to their case, and William found himself wondering whether his remorse was genuine or just another legal strategy. They ultimately decided to decline the meeting, feeling that it would be too emotionally difficult and potentially problematic for the upcoming trial. They didn't want to do anything that might jeopardize Walsh's testimony or give the defense attorneys ammunition to use against them. As the trial date drew closer, James's recovery continued to progress, but it became clear that he would not be fully healed by the time the trial began. His doctors were optimistic about his long-term prognosis, but he still experienced fatigue, headaches, and memory issues that would likely persist for months or even years. The prosecution team worked closely with James to prepare his testimony, taking care not to overwhelm him while ensuring that he was ready to face what would undoubtedly be aggressive cross-examination from the defense attorneys. James was determined to testify despite the challenges posed by his ongoing recovery. "I need to tell them what happened," James insisted when his parents suggested that his testimony might not be necessary given Walsh's cooperation. "They need to hear from me about what it was like to live in fear for all those months, and what it felt like to think I was going to die that night." Catherine admired her son's courage, but she also worried about the emotional toll that testifying would take on him. The defense attorneys would almost certainly try to paint him as a liar or an unreliable witness because of his head injury, and she feared that such attacks would damage his still fragile confidence. The week before the trial was scheduled to begin, they received unexpected news that would change everything once again. Marcus Thompson's attorney contacted DA Reynolds to indicate that his client might also be interested in a plea agreement, but only if the terms were significantly more favorable than what Walsh had received. This development caught everyone by surprise, as Thompson had shown no signs of remorse or willingness to cooperate throughout the proceedings. His attorney explained that Thompson's family had finally convinced him that going to trial was too risky, especially with Walsh prepared to testify against him. "Thompson is willing to plead guilty to aggravated assault and serve 5 years in prison," DA Reynolds explained to William and Catherine. In exchange, he would provide information about the planning and execution of the attack, and the charges against Rodriguez and Mitchell would be reduced to simple assault. This proposal was far more complex than Walsh's plea agreement, and it would essentially end the case without a trial. All four defendants would serve time in prison, but none would face the maximum sentences that convictions at trial might bring. William and Catherine found themselves facing another difficult decision about the direction of their son's case. Part of them wanted to see the case go to trial, believing that a public airing of all the evidence would send a stronger message about the unacceptability of this kind of violence. But they also recognized that plea agreements would guarantee convictions and prison time for all four defendants, eliminating the risk that a jury might acquit some or all of them. The trial process would also be emotionally exhausting for James and would require him to relive his trauma in a very public forum. As they wrestled with this decision, William and Catherine found themselves thinking about their original goals when they had decided to pursue criminal charges. They wanted justice for their son, but they also wanted to prevent other students from experiencing what James had gone through. The question now was whether those goals would be better served by accepting plea agreements that guaranteed punishment for all the defendants, or by proceeding to trial and risking the possibility of acquittals in exchange for the chance of more severe sentences and greater public awareness of the issue. The decision to reject Marcus Thompson's plea offer and proceed to trial had not been easy, but as William and Catherine sat in the crowded courtroom on the first day of jury selection, they knew they had made the right choice. James had been the deciding factor, insisting that the full truth needed to come out in open court, regardless of the personal cost to their family. "I don't want them to be able to hide behind plea agreements," James had told them during their final family meeting before the trial began. "Other students need to see that this kind of behavior has real consequences, and that victims don't have to suffer in silence." The courtroom was packed with potential jurors, media representatives, family members from both sides, and curious observers who had followed the case through the extensive news coverage. William noticed that several victims' rights advocates were present, along with representatives from student organizations who had taken up James's cause. Judge Hoffman had issued strict orders about courtroom conduct and media coverage, making it clear that she would not tolerate any disruptions that might interfere with the defendant's right to a fair trial. The judge's reputation for running a tight courtroom had given William and Catherine some comfort that the proceedings would be conducted with appropriate dignity. The jury selection process proved to be more complex than either William or Catherine had anticipated. Both the prosecution and defense teams questioned potential jurors extensively about their knowledge of the case, their attitudes toward college life and student behavior, and their ability to remain impartial despite the extensive media coverage. D.A. Reynolds worked methodically to identify jurors who would be sympathetic to James's experience while also being willing to hold the defendants accountable for their actions. She was particularly interested in potential jurors who had children of college age, believing they would understand the fear and devastation that William and Catherine had experienced. The defense teams, led by Harold Blackwell for Marcus Thompson, focused on finding jurors who might be sympathetic to the argument that the incident had been a mutual altercation rather than a coordinated assault. They sought people who had personal experience with college social dynamics, and who might view the case as involving typical student conflicts that had unfortunately escalated. One potential juror, a middle-aged mother of two college students, was dismissed by the defense after she stated during questioning that she believed campus harassment was a serious problem that wasn't being adequately addressed by universities. Another potential juror, a young man who had recently graduated from college himself, was dismissed by the prosecution after he suggested that students should be able to resolve their conflicts without involving the legal system. The process took 3 full days, but eventually 12 jurors and 4 alternates were selected. The final jury consisted of 8 women and 4 men, ranging in age from 25 to 68. They included a retired teacher, a nurse, an engineer, a small business owner, and several other professionals who had convinced both sides that they could evaluate the evidence fairly. Williams studied the faces of the jury members as they were sworn in, trying to gauge whether they would be receptive to the prosecution's case. He knew that these 12 people would ultimately determine whether justice was served for his son, and the weight of that responsibility felt enormous. Opening statements began the following Monday, with D.A. Reynolds presenting the prosecution's case first. She stood before the jury with confidence, her voice clear and strong as she outlined what the evidence would show over the coming weeks. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about a young man who made the courageous decision to stand up to bullies, and how those bullies responded by nearly beating him to death," Reynolds began. James Ashworth was an 18-year-old college freshman who should have been focusing on his studies and making new friends. Instead, He found himself living in fear because 4 older students had decided to make his life a nightmare. Reynolds walked the jury through the timeline of harassment that had preceded the attack, describing specific incidents that had escalated from verbal taunts to property destruction to physical intimidation. She explained how James had struggled with the decision to report the harassment, knowing that it might make his situation worse, but ultimately feeling that he had no choice. The evidence will show that these defendants didn't just wake up one morning and decide to hurt James Ashworth, Reynolds continued. This was a calculated campaign of terror that culminated in a brutal assault that left a promising young man fighting for his life. The prosecutor used visual aids to show the jury photographs of James's injuries, images that were so graphic that several jury members visibly reacted with shock and disgust. Catherine had to look away from the photos, even though she had seen them before. Seeing her son's battered face projected on a large screen for the entire courtroom to see was almost unbearable. The defendants want you to believe that this was just a college fight that got out of hand, Reynolds said as she gestured toward the defense table. But college fights don't typically involve 4 attackers using weapons against one victim. College fights don't typically result in traumatic brain injuries and months of hospitalization. When it was time for the defense to present their opening statement, Harold Blackwell approached the jury with the calm confidence that had made him one of the most successful criminal defense attorneys in the state. His strategy was immediately apparent as he began to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, what happened on the night of October 15th was indeed tragic, and my client Marcus Thompson deeply regrets his role in the events that led to James Ashworth's injuries, Blackwell began. But tragedy and criminal intent are not the same thing. What you will see over the course of this trial is that this incident was the result of miscommunication, poor judgment, and circumstances that spiraled beyond anyone's control. Blackwell painted a picture of James as a troubled student who had been making false accusations against his clients for weeks, creating tension and conflict that eventually erupted into violence. He suggested that James had been the aggressor on the night of the attack, confronting the defendants in an aggressive manner that had forced them to defend themselves. Mr. Ashworth was not the innocent victim that the prosecution portrays, Blackwell continued. He was an angry young man who had been threatening to file false reports against my clients, threatening their academic futures and their reputations. When they attempted to reason with him on the night in question, he became violent, and the situation unfortunately escalated. Catherine felt sick listening to this characterization of her son. Every instinct she had as a mother wanted her to stand up and object to the lies being told about James, but she forced herself to remain calm and trust that the evidence would speak for itself. Blackwell went on to suggest that James's injuries, while serious, were not as severe as the prosecution claimed, and that they were the result of an accidental fall during the altercation rather than deliberate assault. He argued that the defendants had actually tried to help James after he was injured, calling for medical assistance, and remaining at the scene until help arrived. What you will see in this case is not 4 criminals who set out to destroy another student's life, Blackwell concluded. What you will see is 4 young men who made mistakes in judgment during a tense situation, and who have already paid a tremendous price for those mistakes through the destruction of their own academic and professional futures. The prosecution's case began with the testimony of the first responders who had been called to the scene of the attack. Paramedic Jennifer Walsh described finding James unconscious and bleeding in the parking lot, surrounded by the 4 defendants who claimed they had found him that way. Mr. Ashworth was in critical condition when we arrived, Walsh testified. He was unconscious, had significant head trauma, and was bleeding internally. We had to perform emergency interventions at the scene before we could safely transport him to the hospital. The paramedics' testimony established the severity of James's condition and raised questions about the defendants' claim that they had simply found him injured. If they had truly discovered James after an accident, Walsh explained, they would have immediately called for help rather than standing around the victim. Dr. Sarah Mitchell returned to testify about James's treatment at the hospital, providing even more detailed medical testimony than she had during the preliminary hearing. The prosecution used anatomical models and medical diagrams to help the jury understand the extent of James's injuries and the treatment he had required. Mr. Ashworth's injuries were severe and life-threatening, Dr. Mitchell explained. The pattern of trauma was consistent with multiple deliberate strikes rather than accidental injury. Without immediate medical intervention, he likely would have died from his injuries. The defense attempted to challenge Dr. Mitchell's conclusions during cross-examination, but her expertise and The thoroughness of her treatment made their questions seem desperate rather than compelling. The medical evidence was simply too clear to dispute effectively. Detective Robert Hayes provided detailed testimony about the investigation, including the recovery of weapons at the scene and the analysis of security footage that captured portions of the attack. The detective's calm, professional presentation of the evidence was compelling, and his years of experience investigating violent crimes lent credibility to his conclusions about what had happened. The evidence at the scene was consistent with a coordinated assault, Detective Hayes testified. The weapons were positioned in ways that suggested they had been brought to the scene for the purpose of intimidating or harming the victim. The pattern of blood evidence and the location of various items all supported the conclusion that this was not a mutual altercation. The prosecution also called several students who had witnessed aspects of the harassment campaign that preceded the attack. These witnesses painted a vivid picture of the systematic intimidation that James had endured, describing incidents that ranged from verbal threats to property damage to physical confrontations in campus buildings. Maria Santos, a sophomore who lived in the same dormitory as James, testified about finding offensive graffiti on James's door and witnessing several confrontations between James and the defendants in the dormitory common areas. James was clearly scared, Santos testified. He started avoiding common areas where he might encounter them, and he stopped participating in dormitory activities that he had previously enjoyed. It was obvious that something was really wrong. When it came time for Dylan Walsh to testify as a cooperating witness, the courtroom was electric with tension. This was the moment that everyone had been waiting for, the insider testimony that would either make or break the prosecution's case. Walsh took the stand looking nervous but determined. He had lost weight since his arrest, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he had not been sleeping well. As he raised his right hand to be sworn in, Catherine noticed that his hands were trembling slightly. D.A. Reynolds began with basic questions about Walsh's background and his relationship with the other defendants. She established that he had been a friend of Marcus Thompson since high school, and that Thompson had recruited him to participate in what he described as teaching James Ashworth a lesson. Marcus told us that Ashworth was trying to get us in trouble with false reports, Walsh testified. He said we needed to scare him into backing down from his threats to file complaints against us. Walsh went on to describe how the attack had been planned over several days, with Thompson organizing the group and deciding on the time and location for the confrontation. According to Walsh's testimony, the plan had originally been to intimidate James verbally, but Thompson had brought weapons just in case things got physical. Marcus said we needed to make sure Ashworth understood that there would be consequences if he tried to get us expelled, Walsh continued. He said we couldn't let some freshman think he could push us around and destroy our futures. The most damaging part of Walsh's testimony concerned the actual attack itself. He described how James had initially tried to walk away when confronted by the group, but had been surrounded and prevented from leaving. When James had attempted to call for help on his cell phone, Thompson had knocked the device from his hands, and the violence had escalated from there. Once Marcus hit him the first time, everything happened really fast, Walsh testified, his voice barely above a whisper. James tried to defend himself, but there were 4 of us and only one of him. Kevin and Brian started hitting him with the bat and the pipe, and Marcus kept telling them not to stop until he learned his lesson. Walsh's description of the attack was graphic and disturbing, and several jury members appeared visibly shaken by his testimony. Catherine found herself gripping William's hand so tightly that her knuckles were white, and she had to focus on breathing steadily to keep from breaking down in the courtroom. "What did you do while this was happening?" Reynolds asked. "I was scared," Walsh admitted. "I wanted it to stop, but I was afraid that if I tried to intervene, they would turn on me too. I just stood there and watched while they beat him unconscious." The cross-examination of Walsh was brutal, with each defense attorney taking turns trying to discredit his testimony and paint him as a liar who was saying whatever the prosecution wanted to hear in exchange for a reduced sentence. Harold Blackwell was particularly aggressive, suggesting that Walsh was fabricating details about the planning and coordination of the attack. "Isn't it true, Mr. Walsh, that you've been promised a reduced sentence in exchange for your testimony against my client?" Blackwell asked. "Yes, but I'm telling the truth about what happened," Walsh replied. "And isn't it also true that you initially denied any involvement in the attack when you were first questioned by police?" "Yes, I lied at first because I was scared, but I'm telling the truth now." Blackwell pressed Walsh on inconsistencies between his current testimony and statements he had made to police earlier in the investigation. While there were some minor discrepancies, Walsh's core story remained consistent throughout the cross-examination. The testimony of the other witnesses continued for another week, with the prosecution building a comprehensive picture of the harassment campaign and the brutal attack that had nearly killed James. Each piece of evidence reinforced the central theme that this had been a deliberate, coordinated assault rather than a mutual altercation. When it came time for James himself to testify, the courtroom was completely silent. He walked slowly to the witness stand, still showing some effects of his injuries in his careful movements and slightly slurred speech. Catherine felt her heart breaking all over again as she watched her son prepare to relive the worst experience of his life in front of a room full of strangers. James's testimony was powerful and heartbreaking. He spoke calmly about the months of harassment he had endured, describing how it had affected every aspect of his life, and ultimately driven him to the decision to report the incidents to university authorities. "I didn't want to get anyone in trouble," James testified. "I just wanted them to leave me alone so I could focus on my studies. I thought if I reported it through official channels, maybe the university could help resolve the situation without anyone getting hurt." When DA Reynolds asked James to describe the night of the attack, his voice became quieter and more hesitant. It was clear that some of his memories of the incident were still unclear due to his head injury, but what he could remember was consistent with the other evidence that had been presented. "I saw them waiting for me by my car, and I knew something bad was going to happen," James said. "I tried to walk away, but they surrounded me. Marcus started yelling at me about the reports I had filed, and then someone hit me from behind. After that, everything gets fuzzy until I woke up in the hospital." The defense cross-examination of James was careful and restrained, with the attorneys clearly aware that attacking a severely injured victim too aggressively might backfire with the jury. They focused primarily on James's memory issues and the possibility that he might be mistaken about some details due to his head injury. However, James held up well under questioning, admitting when he couldn't remember something clearly but remaining firm about the details he could recall. His sincerity and obvious continuing struggle with the effects of his injuries made him a compelling witness. The defense case began 3 weeks into the trial, and from the opening moments, it was clear that Harold Blackwell and his co-counsel intended to wage an aggressive campaign to discredit not only the prosecution's evidence, but also James's character. William and Catherine steeled themselves for what they knew would be the most difficult part of the entire legal process. The defense's first witness was Dr. Michael Randolph, a forensic psychologist hired to evaluate James's mental state both before and after the incident. Dr. Randolph testified that James had exhibited signs of paranoid behavior and social anxiety that predated the alleged harassment, suggesting that he might have misinterpreted normal college social interactions as threatening. "Young people often struggle with the transition to university life," Dr. Randolph explained to the jury. "Mr. Ashworth's academic records show a pattern of social isolation and difficulty forming peer relationships that began well before he encountered the defendants. It's possible that his perception of harassment was colored by pre-existing psychological issues." Catherine felt her anger rising as she listened to this testimony. The suggestion that her son had somehow imagined or exaggerated months of systematic intimidation was not only false, but cruel. James had always been a well-adjusted, socially competent young man before encountering the defendants. During cross-examination, DA Reynolds systematically dismantled Dr. Randolph's conclusions by pointing out that he had never actually examined James personally and was basing his opinions on incomplete records and speculation rather than direct observation. "Dr. Randolph, you've testified about Mr. Ashworth's alleged psychological problems, but isn't it true that you've never actually met or examined him?" Reynolds asked. "That's correct, but I've reviewed extensive documentation about his behavior patterns," Dr. Randolph replied. "And isn't it also true that these behavior patterns you've identified could easily be explained by the stress of being systematically harassed by older students?" Dr. Randolph was forced to admit that harassment and intimidation could indeed produce the same symptoms he had attributed to pre-existing psychological problems. His testimony lost much of its impact under Reynolds's skilled questioning. The defense then called character witnesses for each of the defendants, parading a series of teachers, coaches, and community leaders who testified about what wonderful young men the accused had been before this incident. Each witness spoke glowingly about the defendant's academic achievements, community service, and leadership potential. Marcus Thompson's former high school principal, Robert Shin, testified that Marcus had been student body president and had organized numerous charitable events during his senior year. Marcus was exactly the kind of student every educator hopes to work with, Chen said. He was a natural leader who inspired his peers to achieve their best. Catherine found these character testimonials deeply frustrating. While she didn't doubt that the defendants might have been model citizens in other contexts, it seemed irrelevant to what they had done to her son. If anything, their previous good behavior made their actions seem more calculated and deliberate. The defense's strategy became clearer when they called Professor Linda Morrison, James's academic advisor, to testify about his performance and behavior during his first semester at the university. Morrison painted a picture of a student who was struggling academically and socially, suggesting that he might have been looking for someone to blame for his difficulties. James seemed to have unrealistic expectations about university life, Morrison testified. When he encountered normal social conflicts and academic challenges, he appeared to interpret them as personal attacks rather than typical adjustment issues that most freshmen experience. This testimony was particularly damaging because it came from someone within the university system who had worked directly with James. However, during cross-examination, it became clear that Morrison had only met with James twice during the entire semester, and her impressions were based on very limited interactions. The most difficult moment came when Marcus Thompson himself took the stand in his own defense. Blackwell had clearly coached him extensively, and Thompson presented himself as a remorseful young man who had been trying to help resolve a conflict peacefully when things had spiraled out of control. "I never intended for anyone to get seriously hurt," Thompson testified, looking directly at the jury with what appeared to be sincere remorse. "James had been making accusations about me and my friends that could have ruined our futures. I just wanted to talk to him and try to work things out man to man." Thompson's version of events portrayed the confrontation as a legitimate attempt to resolve their differences that had escalated when James became aggressive and threatening. According to his testimony, he and the others had only used physical force when James had attacked them first. "James came at us swinging," Thompson claimed. "We had to defend ourselves. Nobody wanted it to turn into a fight, but we couldn't just let him hurt us." Catherine watched Thompson's performance with disgust. His ability to present himself as the victim while sitting just 20 feet away from her son, who was still recovering from the injuries Thompson had inflicted, was both infuriating and deeply disturbing. D.A. Reynolds's cross-examination of Thompson was methodical and devastating. She confronted him with Dylan Walsh's testimony about the planning that had gone into the attack, with the physical evidence that contradicted his version of events, and with his own previous statements to police that differed significantly from his current testimony. "Mr. Thompson, you testified that this was a spontaneous confrontation that got out of hand, but isn't it true that you specifically recruited 3 other students to accompany you to confront Mr. Ashworth?" Reynolds asked. "We went together because we all had issues with James's behavior," Thompson replied carefully. "It wasn't like I was recruiting an army or something. And isn't it also true that you brought weapons to this supposedly peaceful conversation?" "Those weren't weapons. The bat belonged to Kevin, and the pipe was just something we found in the parking lot." Reynolds methodically picked apart each of Thompson's explanations, forcing him to acknowledge inconsistencies and contradictions in his story. By the time the cross-examination was complete, Thompson's credibility had been severely damaged. The other 2 defendants, Kevin Rodriguez and Brian Mitchell, also testified in their own defense, but their stories were less polished than Thompson's and contained even more obvious contradictions. Rodriguez claimed that he had only used the baseball bat to defend himself when James had attacked him with his bare hands, while Mitchell insisted that the metal pipe he had wielded was picked up accidentally during the chaos of the fight. Neither defendant could adequately explain why 4 armed college students had needed to defend themselves so violently against one unarmed victim, or why they had continued beating James even after he was unconscious on the ground. The defense case concluded with closing arguments that attempted to raise reasonable doubt about the prosecution's version of events. Blackwell argued that the case was built on the testimony of Dylan Walsh, a co-conspirator who had every reason to lie in order to reduce his own sentence. "Ladies and gentlemen, Dylan Walsh is not a reliable witness," Blackwell told the jury. "He has admitted to being a liar who will say anything to save himself from prison." The prosecution has built their entire case on the word of someone who has already proven that he cannot be trusted to tell the truth. Blackwell went on to argue that the physical evidence was ambiguous and could support multiple interpretations of what had happened that night. He suggested that James's injuries, while serious, were the result of an accidental fall during a mutual altercation rather than a deliberate assault. Tragic accidents happen, especially when young people allow their emotions to override their judgment, Blackwell concluded. But tragedy is not the same as criminal intent, and you cannot convict these young men of serious crimes based on speculation and the testimony of an admitted liar. D.A. Reynolds's closing argument was passionate and compelling, weaving together all the evidence that had been presented over the past month to paint a clear picture of what had really happened to James. The defense wants you to believe that this was just a tragic accident, but the evidence tells a very different story, Reynolds began. This was a calculated assault by 4 defendants who had spent months terrorizing one victim, and who finally decided to silence him permanently when he had the courage to speak up. Reynolds walked the jury through each piece of evidence, from the months of documented harassment to the weapons found at the scene to the medical testimony about James's injuries. She reminded them of Dylan Walsh's detailed testimony about the planning that had gone into the attack and the defendant's own admissions of guilt. James Ashworth was an 18-year-old freshman who committed the crime of trying to get an education without being terrorized by bullies, Reynolds continued. For that crime, he was beaten unconscious by 4 defendants who used weapons to inflict injuries that nearly killed him. The prosecutor concluded by asking the jury to send a message that this kind of violence would not be tolerated in their community. These defendants have shown no genuine remorse for their actions, and they have spent the last month trying to blame their victim for his own assault. Don't let them escape responsibility for what they did. Hold them accountable for their choices. The jury deliberated for 2.5 days, during which William and Catherine alternated between hope and despair as they tried to interpret every possible meaning behind the length of the deliberations. They had been warned that a quick verdict usually favored the prosecution, while longer deliberations might indicate that the jury was struggling with reasonable doubt. When the jury finally returned to the courtroom, the tension was so thick it was almost suffocating. William and Catherine held hands tightly as they watched the 12 people who would determine their family's future file back into the jury box. Judge Hoffman asked the jury foreman, a retired teacher named Margaret Stevens, whether the jury had reached a verdict on all charges against all defendants. "We have, Your Honor," Stevens replied, holding a folded piece of paper that contained the culmination of months of legal proceedings and years of their family's struggle for justice. The verdicts were read one by one, charge by charge, defendant by defendant. Marcus Thompson was found guilty of aggravated assault, conspiracy to commit assault, and intimidation. Kevin Rodriguez was found guilty on all charges. Brian Mitchell was found guilty of aggravated assault and conspiracy, but the jury had been unable to reach a unanimous decision on the intimidation charge. When the final verdict was read, Catherine broke down completely, sobbing with relief and exhaustion as months of pent-up emotion finally found release. William wrapped his arms around his wife, feeling his own tears threatening to spill over as he absorbed the magnitude of what had just happened. James, who had been present for the verdict despite his ongoing recovery challenges, sat quietly with tears streaming down his face. He had insisted on being in the courtroom when the verdicts were announced, wanting to see justice served with his own eyes. The sentencing hearing took place 6 weeks later, after probation officers had compiled comprehensive reports on each defendant's background and the impact of their crimes on the victim. William and Catherine were given the opportunity to address the court before sentences were imposed, a moment they had been both anticipating and dreading. Catherine spoke first, her voice trembling with emotion as she described the impact the attack had on their entire family. "Our son was supposed to be learning and growing during his first year of college," she said, looking directly at the defendants. Instead, he was fighting for his life because 4 young men decided that their egos were more important than another human being's safety. William's statement focused on the broader implications of the case and his hope that the sentences would send a message to other potential perpetrators. "What happened to our son was not just a tragedy for our family," he said. "It was an attack on the very idea that students should be able to pursue their education without fear of violence and intimidation." James had written his own victim impact statement, which was read aloud by D.A. Reynolds because James was still experiencing speech difficulties that made public speaking challenging for him. In his statement, James described the ongoing effects of his injuries and his determination to complete his education despite the obstacles he now faced. "I refuse to let what happened to me define the rest of my life," James's statement concluded. But I also refuse to let it be forgotten or minimized. What these defendants did to me was wrong, and I hope that the sentences you impose today will help prevent other students from experiencing what I went through. Judge Hoffman sentenced Marcus Thompson to 12 years in prison, finding that his role as the ringleader and his lack of genuine remorse warranted the harshest punishment. Kevin Rodriguez received 10 years, while Brian Mitchell was sentenced to 8 years. All three would be eligible for parole after serving at least 60% of their sentences. As the defendants were led away in handcuffs, Catherine noticed that Thompson still showed no emotion whatsoever. Even in the face of a lengthy prison sentence, he appeared to feel no remorse for what he had done to their son. The civil lawsuit that William and Catherine filed against the university was settled 6 months later for an undisclosed amount that would help cover James's ongoing medical expenses and ensure that he could complete his education without financial stress. More importantly, the settlement included provisions requiring the university to implement comprehensive anti-harassment policies and training programs designed to prevent future incidents. James transferred to a different university for his sophomore year, where he was able to start fresh without the constant reminders of his traumatic experience. His recovery continued to progress, though he would always deal with some cognitive effects from his brain injury. He changed his major from pre-med to education, inspired by his experience to pursue a career helping other young people navigate difficult situations. 2 years after the attack, James spoke at a national conference on campus safety, sharing his story with administrators and student affairs professionals from across the country. His speech was powerful and moving, focusing not on his own suffering but on the importance of creating campus environments where all students could feel safe and supported. What happened to me was terrible, but it's also preventable, James told the audience. When universities take harassment seriously from the very beginning, when students feel comfortable reporting problems without fear of retaliation, and when there are real consequences for predatory behavior, tragedies like mine don't have to happen. Catherine and William attended the conference with their son, and as they listened to him speak with such wisdom and courage about his experience, they felt an overwhelming sense of pride in the young man he had become. The attack had changed their family forever, but it had not broken their son's spirit or his determination to make something positive come from his suffering. The defendants served their sentences at different facilities, with varying degrees of success in their rehabilitation. Dylan Walsh, who had cooperated with the prosecution, was released after 18 months and enrolled in community college with plans to transfer to a 4-year institution. He had written several letters to James apologizing for his role in the attack, though James had chosen not to respond. Kevin Rodriguez and Brian Mitchell served their full sentences and were released within months of each other. Both struggled to rebuild their lives after prison, finding that their criminal records made it difficult to gain admission to educational institutions or find meaningful employment. Marcus Thompson was denied parole at his first hearing when the parole board determined that he had shown insufficient remorse for his crimes and posed an ongoing risk to public safety. He would remain in prison for at least 2 more years before becoming eligible for another parole hearing. The case had lasting impacts beyond the immediate participants. The university where the attack occurred implemented some of the most comprehensive anti-harassment policies in the country, and James's story became a powerful tool for advocates working to improve campus safety nationwide. 5 years after the attack, William and Catherine established the James Ashworth Foundation, dedicated to supporting victims of campus violence and promoting prevention programs at colleges and universities across the nation. James served on the foundation's board while completing his graduate degree in educational psychology. "We never wanted to be experts on campus violence," Catherine said during the foundation's inaugural fundraising dinner. "But since we've been forced to learn about it the hard way, we're determined to use that knowledge to help other families avoid what we went through." The foundation's work included lobbying for stronger federal legislation regarding campus safety, providing financial assistance to victims of campus violence, and developing educational programs that could be implemented at institutions nationwide. Within 3 years, the foundation had helped change policies at more than 200 colleges and universities. James eventually returned to his original goal of pursuing a career in medicine, but with a new focus on trauma recovery and rehabilitation. He wanted to help other victims of violence reclaim their lives and reach their potential despite the obstacles they faced. "My attackers took a lot from me," James said during his medical school application interview. "But They didn't take my determination to make a difference in the world. If anything, they made that determination stronger. As William and Catherine watched their son graduate from medical school 8 years after the attack that had nearly killed him, they reflected on the long journey their family had traveled together. There had been moments when they wondered if they would ever feel whole again, times when the legal battle and media attention had seemed almost as traumatic as the original attack. But seeing James walk across that stage to receive his diploma, knowing the incredible obstacles he had overcome to reach that moment, they felt a profound sense of gratitude for the strength their family had found together. The attack had changed them all irrevocably, but it had not defeated them. The defendants who had sought to silence James and destroy his future had ultimately failed in their most important goal. James had not only survived but thrived, using his experience to help countless other victims and to create positive change in the world. Standing in that graduation auditorium, surrounded by hundreds of other families celebrating their children's achievements, William and Catherine finally felt that justice had been truly served. It had taken years rather than months, and it had required much more than just criminal convictions and prison sentences. But, in the end, the best revenge against those who had tried to destroy their son was the life he had built from the ashes of their cruelty. As James took his first steps toward a career dedicated to healing others, his parents knew that the scared, injured boy they had found in that hospital room had grown into exactly the kind of man they had always hoped he would become. The attack had been intended to break him, but, instead, it had revealed the unbreakable strength that had been within him all along.